All right, everybody, good morning. How are you? Hope you're doing well. Just as a short recap from last week, we covered day 3 of creation, which is recorded in Genesis chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. And we see the dry land appears during this day. And this happens as the granite crust, or what is termed the rakia, it sags down in many different places worldwide, and it comes in contact with the mantle below. And this now allows the surface waters to drain into the depressions, forming the seas that is referenced in that passage in the Genesis 1 verse 10, 9 and 10. So places where the crust sinks and presses against the mantle below are mentioned in other places in the Bible. About 7 different passages talk about this, and these are called pillars, and this would give the earth stability, a solid foundation on which to rest, which the crust would rest upon. So this is also referenced in several passages that we covered last week. And we also covered some biblical passages that were regarding this arrangement. And then we also looked at some extra biblical writings. Although not considered to be scripture, there's some very interesting passages that are from passages that are not considered to be scripture, and they end up agreeing with Genesis exactly. And we ended up by examining the entire first chapter of Genesis. And although there are 6 days of creation, we found that there's only 5 of these days that God describes as being good. And we find that day 2, as we looked at this, was the only creation day that wasn't described as being good. And it's not that anything bad happens on day 2. It's just that we find that what starts on day 2 doesn't finish until day 3. So that's when it's declared to be very good. And I think that's just an interesting observation. So starting today, as you see up on the screen here, it's time for another episode of Steve's Soapbox. And before I hear the groaning from the crowd, I don't do this very often, but I think this is, hopefully this is interesting. So now we've completed our look at Genesis 1, 6 through 10. I would like to propose a translation that I'm going to call the SRSV translation, which stands for Steve's Revised Scientific Version. And so we're going to look at this verse with a scientific point of view. So this version would then read, "And God said, I will make a 60-mile thick granite crust shell that covers the entire earth, and place half of the waters above that granite crust and half of the waters below that granite crust, creating a sealed barrier between the 2 bodies of water to separate the waters above from the waters below, or to separate the waters from each other. And then I made this happen. I made the granite crust and put about half of the water I created on day 1 above the crust and half below the granite crust. And then I named the granite crust heaven, since this would be a unique place that I will openly dwell with my creation, including the first humans that I'm planning on creating 4 days from now. And there was evening and morning, a second day of creation." And then verse 9 and 10, I think, would read, "And then I said, let the waters under the granite crust be moved below the crust into one interconnected chamber, because the denser parts of the crust above would now sag downward because of the forces of gravity that I also created. And thus at many locations around the earth, it will come in contact with the mantle below, allowing the surface waters to drain into the newly formed depressions on the surface of the earth, allowing now dry land to rise up out of the water. And it happened just as I wanted. And I called the dry ground land, and the gathering together of waters on the surface of the earth I called seas. And I saw that it was good." So again, I think that takes it from a little more of a scientific perspective. I know I'm reading more into the verse than what's really written there, but I think this is scripturally correct. I think this is correct. So again, with this in mind, again, Genesis 1, 6 through 8 states that there's a rakia, or expanse of the crust, around the entire earth. And its purpose is to divide the waters above and below. And this is exactly what Dr. Brown, I think, accurately names the hydroplates. It's these plates that are then suspended on waters below, upon the waters below and underneath the waters above. And as I think we'll see here in the discussion of the Great Flood of Genesis 6 through 8, there's a great amount of scientific evidence that supports this arrangement and the reasons for it. So now that we see a lot of support, I think, for this trapped subterranean water created during creation week, we'll now turn attention to the question here. What would be the purpose of this arrangement? As we study the Bible, we do see that God has an underlying purpose to everything he does, and nothing happens that is out of his control. Nothing happens just out of chance, as the theory of evolution proposes. All of God's creation is directed by an amazing intelligence. It's not blind chance. It happens for a reason. God has purpose for everything he does. Again, this is in stark comparison to evolution, which is total blind chance, randomness, not directed by anything. We see, I think, the intelligence behind the creation when we study it. And this is as Romans 1 verse 20 talks about, that God's divine nature can be clearly seen by investigating what's been made. And if you don't see this, the passage goes on and says, there's no excuse. You can't, there's no excuse for you not being able to see this. And numerous passages also state that God is indeed in control. And Proverbs 19:21, for example, states that it's God's purpose that always prevails. And Psalms 22:28 also states that dominion belongs to the Lord and he rules over the nations. He is before all things, and in all things hold together, as stated in Colossians 1:17. And Isaiah 45:5-7 states this amazing passage regarding him being in control, and that he brings both prosperity and disaster. He says, I am the Lord, and there's no other. Apart from me, there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me, so that from the rising of the sun to the place of its setting, people may know that there is none besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form the light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things. So God is active. He's doing things. Nothing happens without his knowledge, without his purpose. So back to this question about the quantities of trapped water far below the Earth's granite crust. Is there a purpose for this? So God, I think, certainly would have made the Earth in this arrangement. And I think we can be sure that there was a purpose. It was for his purposes. And we can see from studying Scripture that I believe that there are two purposes for this arrangement. One that concerns the time frame from creation, when it was first established, up until the time just right at the start of the Great Flood. And then we also see that the second purpose would be what would occur at the time of the Great Flood, when it starts in Genesis 7:11. And we've read several passages, I think, that make this second purpose pretty clear, without any doubt. One of these passages we discussed earlier is 2 Peter 3:5-6. We see here clearly that one of these purposes of this trapped subterranean waters is to be the source of water that destroys the earth in the Great Flood. It's a reference back to that. Another important passage regarding the flood and its purpose is found in Matthew 24:39, which states, and they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. In this passage, Jesus told the disciples that nobody other than God the Father knows the day or the hour of his second coming. Now he's emphasizing that nobody will even see it coming. There will be no time for last-minute preparations, basically. But in this passage here, Christ compares his return as judge and king. This is described in Revelation 19:11-15. He compares this to the onset of the flood in Noah's day. I think we can be certain that these waters from the flood Jesus is referencing here is the subterranean waters that are released when the foundations of the great deep burst forth, as we see in Genesis 7:11. And the purpose of these waters below, again, was to destroy mankind. And the reason for that, it tells us in the previous passages in Genesis, that it's become evil. Humankind had become so evil at the time that God feels at that point, I have no choice. I have to destroy what's going on. There's just too much evil. So what about that time before the flood, from the creation week up until the beginning of the flood? So this is the first time frame we want to talk about here. So what would happen up until the beginning of the flood, or perhaps maybe if the flood never even happened? Would there have been a purpose for this arrangement? And I guess, as we stated earlier, I don't believe that the breaking up or bursting forth of the fountains of the great deep causing the great worldwide flood was an inevitable outcome of this arrangement. So the question comes up often, was the earth a ticking time bomb? So was it inevitable that the crust would rupture and the world would be flooded? I don't think so. If sin hadn't entered the world, I believe the earth would still have this arrangement that was created during creation week. Recall again, at the end of creation week, God declares everything exceedingly good. So the thought that the earth one day would reach this inevitable bursting forth of the fountains of the great deep would have happened if man never sinned. I don't think it seems to be something that would be described as exceedingly good. This wasn't something I don't believe that was inevitable. It is because the earth had become so violent and full of evil. This is described in Genesis 6:5, where it states the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become, and that the very thought of the human heart was only evil all the time. And it's kind of hard to imagine this. I mean, obviously, the world is full of a lot of evil right now, right? But this makes it sound like, or certainly Noah's the only one that's found to be righteous. However many people were on earth at that time, and there's estimates about how many there may have been. It could be millions or maybe even a billion or so. There's only one person, thankfully. There was that one person that was found to be righteous. And so in Genesis 6:13, God then tells Noah he's going to put an end to all the people because the earth is so full of evil and violence. And the method of accomplishing this would be to bring the flood waters to destroy the life on earth. And my personal opinion is that since God gives the exact month and day of when the flood will occur, will begin, that I think it's by his hand that he would have initiated an initial crack in the crust that would have then, now fully knowing what, God would fully know what would happen when this crack started, would have set into motion a series of events that would flood the earth, and also a series of other events that would greatly change the earth, totally change the earth. So when this brings this trapped subterranean waters to the earth's surface, there should have been, there is tremendous evidence of this. God spoke the universe into existence, right? So commanding such a small thing to happen at the right time, which is all it would take, is not difficult to imagine. And while we, in talking about creation science, would not want to invoke the use of miracles where they're not warranted, I think it's, again, we want to use as few assumptions as possible, and only rely on not rely on miracles. We also do know that many miracles are recorded in Scripture, and so it's obvious, I think, to me, that this could have been a miracle that God started, a small crack, and as we'll see, there's tension in the crust, and a small crack could have set this whole thing into motion. It wouldn't have taken much. So this begins, again, a series of events that logically follow from this, and many of these Earth's mysterious features that we'll cover are explained by this, and they're not explained by current evolutionary theory. We'll see that as we look through some of these. So again, we're going to look at this in detail as we come over the next few weeks. So if mankind had not progressed to this point where God thought it was necessary to bring a flood to destroy the earth, what could the arrangement of the surface waters, crust, subterranean chambers, and pillars arrangement be for prior to the flood? And was there a reason for this? So we recall that the date of the beginning of the flood occurs somewhere around 1656 years after creation, according to most biblical timelines. And this date is also consistent with a number of other non-biblical dating methods, such as radiocarbon dating or carbon-14 dating. Tree ring dating supports this, and historical records of comets. If you were in my class before, we talked about comets, and we'll bring that up again a little later on. These are just a few examples that all confirm the dates that the Bible gives us as far as when the flood occurs, and then of course we can trace that back to the creation week. So we have a really nice timeline here of from creation to today, actually. So all these evidences and others are in basic agreement with this approximate date. But up until the beginning of the flood, was there a logical reason for this arrangement? So let's now look at what would have occurred just after dry land appears up out of the waters, and then the following centuries up until the time of the beginning of the Great Flood. And as we progress through this next series of slides, I do want to give a special note to a man named Brian Nichol. Brian Nichols is a mathematical or a mechanical engineer in the aerospace industry, and he has studied and is very committed to hydroplate theory and its scientific and biblical accuracy. And he's produced a number of PowerPoint presentations. They can be found on YouTube, and I can direct you where you can find these if you're interested. And you can also, I can direct you to somewhere where you can find his original PowerPoint presentations. And I'll be using a number of the slides here that come from slides he has put together. And I've made some changes to some of them in the wording to kind of increase the clarity and detail in some of these. And some changes, slight changes to some of the slides themselves, but I think he deserves special recognition for some pretty amazing work he has done in order to explain some of the mechanisms of the flood and the resulting aftermath with greater clarity. So he's obviously, you see some of these slides, you're going to obviously see he's spent a lot of time on these slides. He's very talented when it comes to PowerPoint. So what would have occurred just after dry land appears up out of the waters, and then in the following centuries up until the beginning of the flood? So I think one of the purposes of this arrangement would have been to produce what's called geothermal energy, which would have been generated in the granite crust. And this geothermal energy would have been used in the benefit of humans at the time. Geothermal energy would serve a purpose in the pre-flood Earth by warming the surface of the Earth, and in the process would have initiated Earth's pre-flood water cycle. So first, let's just discuss what geothermal energy even is. Geothermal energy is heat related to energy extracted from the crust of the Earth. So today, which is post-flood, of course, energy is extracted from the Earth by the Earth's natural internal heat, along with radioactive decay. And we're going to discuss the origins of the Earth's internal heat as we discuss the effects of the flood. Evolutionists today will tell you that the Earth is molten inside because it was formed that way, and it just hasn't completely cooled off yet, which it should have, given that they say the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. Why hasn't the Earth cooled down? Why isn't it solidified yet? But we're going to look through the hydroplate theory and the mechanisms of the flood, and then we'll see that there's strong evidence the Earth didn't start out molten. It became that way. It actually became that way as a consequence of the flood. So the geothermal energy we use today is from the heated interior of the Earth, because the Earth becomes molten inside because of the flood. But prior to the flood, there was a reason for it, I think. But geothermal energy today, it's been exploited as a source of heat and electric power for thousands of years. And we see this in the form of hot springs or wells below the surface of the Earth, for example. And even in the coldest areas of the Earth, you only have to dig down a few hundred feet below the surface, a relatively short distance, you'll find the internal temperature of the Earth is much, much higher. And it gets much higher as you dig deeper and deeper below the Earth's surface. Typically, the temperature of the Earth's interior increases with depth about 50 or so degrees per mile as you dig downward. So as you go downward, you could be in the most frozen part of the Earth. You dig down around 50 miles or so, and downward, it gets increasingly hotter and hotter. So again, post-flood, this is because so much of the Earth's present interior is molten. It's melted in a melted state. So post-flood, this is what we'd find, and this is the reason why we have this geothermal energy. But what about, again, before the flood occurs? We'll see that the energy that we would expect in the pre-flood Earth also would warm the Earth. And humans would develop technology over the coming centuries after creation, and they would need an energy source. I think God would provide that for them. To fully exercise dominion over the Earth, as it's stated in Genesis 1:28. So realize that today's primary energy sources, such as fossil fuels and nuclear reactors, and this sort of thing, would not have existed before the flood. Fossil fuels, such as coal and oil deposits, are from the vast amounts of vegetation and animal life that was trapped below the surface of the Earth, and there are strata layers as a result of the flood. They wouldn't have been there before the flood, right? There wouldn't have been, there's no fossils before the flood. And So we see today, of course, that there are vast amounts of coal deposits, for example, worldwide. This comes from the tremendous amount of vegetation that was buried during the flood. And we see that this coal and other things, oil and things, would have come about as a result of the flood. But what about, again, going back to pre-flood, what about before the flood? So you're probably already likely aware that today the moon exerts a gravitational influence on the Earth. I will tell you now, right? This is what produces the tides in our ocean today, for example. In other words, if we didn't have the moon there, we wouldn't have the movement in the oceans to produce tides. And in fact, if the waters were in the oceans were stagnant, life couldn't actually exist in the ocean. So all the ocean life would die. So there's a big reason for the moon to be there. It provides a lesser light for the night, as we see in the fourth day. But it also provides this movement in the ocean that allows life to exist, to keep existing. And so we see as the moon gravity works to produce ocean tides because of its gravitational influence on the Earth, we also see the gravitational forces of the moon, although to a much lesser extent than water, because it's a fluid, also exerts a gravitational influence on the solid parts of the Earth. And it would deform or slightly change the surface of the Earth because of this. And so here, this image on the slide, you have to kind of look closely at it because it's kind of subtle. And this has been greatly exaggerated so you can kind of see what's going on. But you see the moon up above, you see the Earth below. And as we follow this animation, you'll see the Earth start to stretch just a little bit. And that's because of the moon's influence on the Earth. Again, this is greatly exaggerated. It doesn't move anywhere near that far. But it's a solid shell of great mass. And the tidal effect, again, not as dramatic as it would be on the sea, but still the crust deforms into a slight egg shape toward the moon. And if we look at this arrangement now, pre-flood, whoops. Okay, if we look at this arrangement now, pre-flood, we'll see the crust supported by many pillars with the trapped subterranean waters below, as we've been discussing. And obviously the graphic here has been greatly exaggerated as well, so you kind of get an idea what's going on here. We've simplified this. There's only 4 pillars where the granite presses into the solid mantle. You'll see these pillars here, 4 of them. You'll see this is the trapped subterranean waters. This is the mantle. This is the outer shell here. So considering the thickness of the outer crust and the global scale of this, it becomes pretty easy to imagine, but I think this illustration probably makes it a little bit easier for us to visualize this. So each tidal cycle would have deformed and stretched the crust above the waters, and this is, of course, driven mainly by the moon's gravity. And the sun gravity probably has a little bit of effect on this also, but to a much lesser extent because of a much greater distance from the Earth to the sun. But now as we watch this animation on this process on this screen, I want you to kind of focus on the yellow line here as we see this go around. This is a pretty cool animation here. So watch the moon as it starts to orbit, and watch as the part of the Earth that's nearest the moon stretches to become closer to the moon. On the far side of the planet, the Earth is actually pulled. This works just exactly the way the tides do. The Earth is pulled a little bit more toward the moon, which stretches it on the far side out. So twice a day, we see this stretching and compressing of the crust pillars. And this friction that's created in this creates a huge amount of energy in the form of heat. So as we look at this, we see the color of the water change, right? It became kind of more yellow. It indicates that it got warmer, got hotter and hotter. So friction causes the cyclical loads to heat the pillars and heat them up. So to get an idea of how forces of friction produce heat, just take a steel wire, let's say like a coat hanger, and bend it back and forth several times and then touch it at the bend. Ever done that before? It becomes pretty hot, right? And as you bend it faster and faster, it gets hotter and hotter. And as I was a kid, I used to do this kind of for fun, you know. Use bend a steel wire with a coat hanger back and forth several times, you know, just to see what would happen, right? Greatly to the dismay of my mom, who saw me destroying all of her coat hangers. But anyway, if you do this, you'll see that this friction, this motion creates heat. And this would have also created heat in the crust. So as the crust flexes, there would have been heat generated in the crust. And also in the subterranean chambers now, we would see heat building up in subterranean chambers. Another example of this is if you do any woodworking, oops, sorry, didn't mean to go that far. If you do any woodworking and you've ever taken a screw out of a piece of wood with a power screwdriver, you'll see that it gets pretty hot. I don't know what's going on my slides here. Start over again. So I have done that many times. I'm a woodworker. So if you take a screw and you screw it out of a piece of wood, it gets pretty hot, right? And many times I've picked up a screw not thinking about it just after I pulled it out of a piece of wood and burned myself. You also use friction when you rub your hands together on a cold day to try to warm them up. So now imagine how much heat would have been generated in extreme pressures in rock that's 60 miles below the surface. So this energy added to the pillars by the gravitational force of the moon would have been huge. This cyclical compression is something, a process that Dr. Brown has given the name tidal pumping. It occurs on day 4 of creation when the sun and the moon and the stars are formed. So as we discussed earlier, gravitational forces cause the dry land to form on day 3. This is the gravitational forces from the Earth itself, allowing dry land to come up. But for the following centuries up until the time of the flood, this process would have continued on. It would have continuously heated the pillars in the subterranean water. And the pressure would have increased in the chamber, but not to the breaking point. I think, again, not to a point where this crust would crack. Remember, it's 60 miles thick. It wouldn't be of a ticking time bomb, as we just discussed. But we read also in Genesis 2, verses 5 through 6, I think we see the reason for this geothermal energy when it states that streams or a mist came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. I think this sets up the pre-flood's water cycle on the surface of the earth. So if we do read Genesis 2, 5 through 6, it says, "Now no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up. For the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. But streams, or a mist, depending on which translation you read, came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground." And the Hebrew word for streams or mist is ed, it's ed, which means a freshwater stream, or a mist, or a source of water. So pre-flood precipitation, I keep doing that. Sorry about that. Pre-flood precipitation then would have been in the form of a very heavy dew or mist that would have risen as a mist that the waters on the surface of the planet would rise up and then fall down as heavy dew every morning or every day. And this would water the whole surface of the ground. So we have to realize that the pre-flood Earth, again, is dramatically different than today's Earth, with much larger likely proportions of land to sea than there is now. It would have been a much more uniform type of environment worldwide, pre-flood, as this passage, I think, certainly suggests here. And I think it was God's intention that the entire Earth would be inhabitable by humans. Not like today, where there are areas that are certainly not suited well for humans to live. I mean, think of the mountain areas that are, you know, there's no way you could live there. I mean, you can't, some of the deserts are so, you know, inhabitable. You know, some areas are just not, or the poles, just not really that inhabitable for humans to live. So I think it's suggested by this passage in the pre-flood Earth would have had a very heavy dew that was likely distributed over the entire Earth, just as Genesis 2:6 states. And the pre-flood Earth also would not have had the miles and miles of deep strata layers or sedimentary layers on top of most land masses as we have now. About 70 or so % of our land masses now are covered with up to miles thick of distinct strata layers, which we'll talk about a little later as well. But these strata layers are a result of the flood. So you got to think the topsoil before the flood would have been different. It would have been probably much more conducive to plant life. It would have probably a much greater tendency to soak in water into the soil, watering the surface very efficiently, providing water for the surface vegetation very efficiently. And the pre-flood groundwater would not have to permeate through these tougher, more impenetrable sedimentary rocks as it does now, so it makes it easier to supply the plants with water. And I think this creates a massive amount of growth. So what happens is the earth has a huge amount of vegetation on it pre-flood. And it's this vegetation that becomes buried in the surface layers after the flood, where we see these huge layers like your coal layers. You'll see some of these coal layers absolutely enormous that are found worldwide. And the coal comes from vegetation. So again, this all becomes as a process from the flood. So this brings up another question that many have raised. Did it rain before the flood? And Genesis 2:6 we just read kind of suggests that it did not rain. But we're not really absolutely certain of this. I wouldn't be completely dogmatic about this. Some do believe that this mist became a evaporation and thus rain cycle. And if so, this passage here indicates that the period of rain was probably no rain was probably fairly brief, and that there was rain before the flood. But if the no rain condition ended sometime before the flood, it's not mentioned anywhere. Why isn't this mentioned somewhere in Scripture that there was rain before the flood? So Dr. Brown states in his footnotes in his book discussing this question that his understanding of Genesis 2:5-6 is that the crops were not yet growing on the newly created earth. The Lord God had not sent rain, and man did not toil yet for food. Hard labor became after the fall. So heavy fog or a mist that rose up from the earth would have watered the earth. I'm not completely sure of this, but it certainly looks this way. Maybe let's look at a few other clues. So if the hydroplate theory is reasonably correct, this process of tidal pumping we just discussed would produce a vast amount of heat about 60 miles below the surface, and calculations by Dr. Brown show that even by the end of the third day of creation, this subterranean water would have built up quite a bit of heat. It actually would become a fourth state of water, we're going to talk about just in a moment, called supercritical water. This water, when it's supercritical, would dissolve a lot of minerals in the lower crust, such as quartz, for example. This would have made the crust underneath very sponge-like, and openings would have opened up, creating a process where this supercritical water would have filled up these spaces in the crust below and would have transferred heat up through the crust, and some of it would rise through the crust all the way to the surface. So again, we also see that there could have been some heat generated by the flexing of the crust itself, just as we talked about with our coat hanger example just a second ago. But these factors would have evaporated groundwater that would have become the mist of the Genesis 2:6 passage, again, where it says, from the earth, and watered, that a mist rose from the earth and watered the whole surface of the earth as heavy dew. And thus it seems to me that the pre-flood precipitation was as heavy dew. Another clue may be the reference to rainbows. So we talk about rainbows in reference to our subject of the Great Flood. What about rainbows? We've all seen rainbows and just how beautiful they can be. In Genesis 9:12-17, God promises never again to flood the earth, and he marks this promise by a bow in the cloud, which is a rainbow. So rainbows form when raindrops refract sunlight. This suggests that rainbows began after the flood and that there was no pre-flood rain. Now, others disagree with this, saying rainbows may have been visible before the flood and afterward, but afterward God simply associates his promise with rainbows. So again, not really sure of this, but it could be. So again, not positive, but some argue that rainbows would have formed before the flood every time water splashed and droplets refracted sunlight. But this arrangement overlooks God's promise concerning rainbows in the cloud, not a relatively few drops of water, just a few feet above the ground of the earth for a few seconds. So again, this is possibly another clue that rainbows might not have been seen before the flood, indicating that there may not have been rain before the flood. So we talked about supercritical water. So let's tell you what that is. So at some point, very likely soon after creation, perhaps even on the third day of creation, liquid water in this trapped subterranean chambers would have changed phase into a state known now as what's called supercritical water. So even though the moon hadn't been created yet, and that comes on day 4, the granite crust would have been heated to some extent by the deforming of the crust. Denser portions sank and pressed against the chamber floor. So this may have caused the water to heat to this point. But we know when the moon is created, I think we can be sure that this happens as the moon is formed. So most of us are familiar with water, of course, existing in 3 forms, right? A solid, when it's ice, a liquid, we normally encounter, or gas, or as vapor. So we all are quite familiar with this, right? We encounter water in all these forms pretty much on a daily basis. Water, for example, is a solid when it's below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, when it freezes. It's a liquid state above the freezing point of 32 degrees, but below the boiling point of 212 degrees. And above the boiling point, water becomes steam and turns into a vapor, evaporates into a gas state. And molecules move and vibrate so quickly when they become of that temperature that they escape up into the atmosphere and become vapor. And of course, in a solid state, as the temperature increases, what happens to ice? It warms up and it turns back into liquid water. So water will go back and forth between these different states, as we see all the time. And water in vapor will condense, and as it cools, it turns back into liquid water. This is the process known as condensation. But it was discovered in 1822 that there's a 4th state of water that's pretty unknown because it only happens in a state that we wouldn't ever encounter. In supercritical fluids, which were discovered in 1822, most today are not even aware of their existence, of the existence of this. This is because water only becomes supercritical when its pressure and temperature exceeds what's called a critical point. So this is a pressure and temperature combination at which the density of the liquid and the density of the vapor become equal with each other. Thus, at the temperature above the crossover point and the pressure greater than the critical point, there's no distinction between it being a fluid and a gas. And the critical point for water is 705 degrees or hotter. And this, of course, is much hotter than the 212 degrees we see when we boil water. Also, at the same time, this water would have to be under a tremendous amount of pressure, a much higher pressure, at about 3,200 psi, or higher, which psi stands for pounds per square inch. And that basically is the amount of force exerted on a 1-inch square area. So 3,200 psi is extremely high amount of pressure. So how much pressure do you think it would be with the weight of the crust on top of this water? It would exceed this 3,200 psi. So we're also probably familiar with the concept of psi when we fill our car tires with air, right? Typically around 30 psi is what was recommended for most car tires, right? So pressure is also measured in something called bars of pressure. And a bar of pressure is basically just slightly less than current atmospheric pressure, which is called, our normal atmospheric pressure basically is 1 bar of pressure. And so atmospheric pressure is the force exerted by the weight of the air above any given point on Earth. And it's essentially the pressure exerted by the atmosphere on all objects within the atmosphere. And the pressure is caused by this air being pulled down due to the forces of gravity. We'll see so many things that are driven by gravity. It's amazing. So the bars of pressure necessary to achieve the state of becoming supercritical is 220.6 bars of pressure or higher. So we have to meet these before the water gets into this 4th state here of being supercritical. So we'll see on our chart here the temperature increase or decrease to the point where water becomes a solid, where it's below 32 degrees. As the pressure increases, this changes somewhat, but water is in a liquid state up in this area, becomes a vapor in this area, and then up here it becomes supercritical when it achieves this 705 degrees with 3,200 psi of pressure or higher. So not only can water become supercritical, other substances can become supercritical also, and this would include carbon dioxide, methane, propane, methanol, nitrous oxide, and other such liquids. Supercritical water also has many industrial applications due to its properties of being a particularly good solvent. We're all probably aware of how water actually is a very good solvent all by itself. Water is often called the universal solvent because it can dissolve more substances than any other liquid. So in chemistry, a solvent is a substance, usually a liquid, that can dissolve another substance, and then it breaks apart the individual molecules of a substance. And you probably all likely have first-hand experience of using water as a dissolvent when you put your dinner dishes in the sink after dinner, right? And you put water in there to kind of break down the food on the plates and dishes, making it a lot easier for it to clean. We do this every day, right? Well, water doesn't necessarily dissolve everything. It doesn't dissolve things like oils, for example, very well. Its solvent properties are critical for life in various natural processes. So we'll see supercritical water also has many industrial applications due to its properties of being a particularly good solvent. One example, for example, is water treatment facilities. Sometimes they use highly reactive supercritical water to oxidize and destroy organic waste materials, including sewage and agricultural waste, and even certain industrial pollutants. And here's one that probably make you and the audience that are coffee lovers happy. Supercritical fluids serve a special role within the food and beverage manufacturing. They're commonly used to decaffeinate green coffee beans. And fluids can also be used to deodorize fish oils, infuse flavor or fragrance, and extract essential oils from botanicals. So this is because supercritical fluids, again, excel as solvents. And CO2 is used very much. Carbon dioxide is used as a supercritical solvent. But also other supercritical fluids like propane and butane are also used. So we'll find that supercritical water in subterranean chambers prior to the flood do play an important part, I think, in the processes of the Great Flood. So now we're going to move forward into the beginning of the Great Flood. This is recorded in Genesis 7 through 10. I guess we're going to have to stop. I guess that's actually a good place to stop. All right. Thank you very much.